Alright, so let's get into this video from Jacob that's been requested 3 or 4 times now. The Cold War from the Soviet perspective. So this video is admittedly from the Soviet perspective, which I like. I also already like this introductory sentence here on the screen. This video is historically accurate, just biased. So just based on the title of this video, I already like it because they're admitting that they're biased, right? The most dishonest thing you can do is say, I'm unbiased, right? Because nobody's unbiased. Everybody has their own interests based on the fact that you're a human, a material human being existing within a material world who has and you have material needs which need to be met. Because of that, you are going to have your own interests, which are going to make you biased. I'm extremely biased in favor of the principles of communism, and wanting a government that serves the people and ending imperialism. These are biases, but you can still get to the truth, right? You can have biases and still find the truth and still have self-critique, and find places where you're incorrect and correct them. But you can only do that, right, if you admit that you're biased. If you understand that you're coming at things from a certain perspective and you have certain interests. So this video is already doing it. It's saying, this is from the Soviet perspective. And it's historically accurate, and it may seem like it's an argument in favor of the Soviet Union or saying the Soviet Union is perfect, right? But it's not. What we get is the American perspective, right? What we get our entire lives is the neoliberal American perspective, which pretends it is entirely unbiased, right? Corporate media and the American education system pretends that it is entirely unbiased. We are just giving you the facts. Or Hollywood, which we've been talking about this whole stream with the art and the movies that come out of Hollywood and the U.S. and the capitalist movie production system, industry, whatever you would call it, that's been deeply, influenced by the CIA and the U.S. State Department to argue in favor of imperialism. But we think of all of this as unbiased, which clouds our thinking a lot, because, like I said, no one's unbiased. So the Soviet Union had their interests, in the Cold War, and the U.S. had their interests in the Cold War. And they both, pursued policies that they hoped would fulfill, see their interests carried out and achieve their goals. What Vijay Prashad writes about a lot in his book, The Darker Nations, and Red Star Over the Third World, is these countries in the global south, in the third world, who also had their own interests. And a lot of times, their interests more so aligned with the Soviet Union, so they tried to ally with the Soviet Union, and that's when the U.S. Engaged in these acts of imperialism to try and maintain control over these countries. But they also had their own unique interests, which in some cases were different from the Soviet Union's, right? So that's why they made what they called the non-aligned movement, where these countries in the global south allied so they could have their own representation at these global institutions like the UN. That were propping up after World War II, and were largely a battleground between Russia and the U.S. The Soviet Union and the U.S. And eventually China. In the third world, the global South is saying we want a voice too. So my point in bringing that up is that it's good to understand where all these different interests were coming from, right? And not pretend like any of these interests are unbiased. Right, but understand that there were many different interests involved in the Cold War, and that's what made the Cold War what it is in its totality. So, yeah, let's go ahead and start watching this video.
Just told from another perspective. The point of this isn't to defend the Soviet Union or to side with it. The point is to get you to think about biases we encounter when hearing about history. More about that in a conclusion. The Cold War started right after the Second World War, so to discuss it, we must start there. In 1939, the fascist armies of Germany invaded most of Europe. At the same time, the fascist army of Japan was invading China as well as other nations and colonies in the Far East. In 1941, the German fascists started a surprise attack against the Soviet Union in an attempt to destroy the socialist revolution and the Bolshevik government. Only through the sacrifice of the Soviet soldiers the German advance was halted. The balance of power slowly shifted as the centrally planned economy of the USSR was adapted towards wartime production. At this time, the capitalist countries finally decided to join on the side of the USSR, though it would take another 2 more years and millions of Soviet dead before they actually joined the fight on the ground. By the time D-Day had happened, the German army was in full retreat already and almost pushed out of the Soviet lands. Within 1 more year, the war in Europe was over and only Japan was still fighting. The Soviet army was advancing in Manchuria and Korea, just as the United States used 2 nuclear bombs on civilian targets in Japan, both to fight the fascists and to send a threat towards the Soviets. Japan was to be occupied by the United States exclusively. The US and USSR could not agree on what to do with Korea, most importantly what economic system it should use, so they decided to split it up and figure it out later.
And in American education, if you learn about World War II, like I went to a liberal arts private college in the Midwest, and I had one professor who was Marxist and, you know, basically a tanky, would defend existing socialism. He studied in China. But there was another professor who actually studied in Russia, who I took the World War II class with, and he was pretty honest about the wartime economy. He was pretty honest about the Soviets, what he described as a command economy, and, you know, they were a little more biased, you know, talking about how authoritarian it was or whatever, as if the U.S. economy that's run by oligarchs isn't authoritarian, but I digress. So he talked about how the Soviet Union was very, very quickly able to focus their economy on wartime production. So they had been focused on industrializing anyways, because they needed to modernize their country and defend from the Western powers, which had invaded after the revolution, which might have been a good thing to add to this video, actually. But the Soviet Union was able to adapt very quickly versus the U.S. government had to, do various things. I can't remember what the name of the act was, but the government had to obviously direct a lot of factories, including like GM factories and stuff, towards making weapons of war, wartime production. Close to where I grew up, there's this thing called the Badger Ammunition Plant, and it's this giant stretch of land that's covered by all these factories that are no longer in use anymore, and they've just been rusting for the last 70 years. Because it was a factory that was set up by the government to produce ammunition for the war. So during the war, the U.S. government had to intervene in various ways to make the economy closer to the economy of the Soviet Union, which is interesting. And, you know, when that was discussed in the World War II class that I was in, I made sure to like make that point, you know, that the U.S. government needed to make it more of a quote-unquote command economy, you know, in order to keep up with the Soviet Union. And my point was obviously that shows that socialist economic planning is better and more rational than capitalist economic planning. But yeah, I just wanted to also point out that the university I went to, they did kind of explain that, albeit in a biased way. So that was good. And somebody in the chat said something about Stranger Things that was interesting. The new Stranger Things, they filmed in a literal Nazi liquidation camp in Lithuania where 200,000 people were murdered. In the show, they dressed it up like a Soviet gulag. It's Holocaust denial and double genocide theory. That is crazy if true. I mean, I obviously would have to look into it to confirm it. But we've been talking this whole time about how deeply the State Department is involved in Hollywood and controls Hollywood, and how for years, you know, they've been blacklisting and blackballing communist creators, communist actors, communist directors, communist writers, and how all these movie studios are connected to what's called the military entertainment complex now, because it's become such a phenomenon. And now, you know, in Europe, you're seeing the U.S. try to portray Russia as fascists, as the U.S. is literally arming and backing neo-Nazi militias. So you're seeing, again, this sort of double genocide theory, you know, communism is the same as fascism, or we'll support the fascists as long as it stops the Russians. And part of that is it's only possible because of the confusing of history by Hollywood, stuff like that, where they're pushing this double genocide theory where Stalin is the same evil as Hitler. It's like, no, the Soviets made an incredible sacrifice to defeat Hitler. They lost 22 million people and inflicted 80% of German casualties. Right? They did the brunt of the fighting, and who knows what would have happened if Hitler would have managed to take the Soviet Union and wasn't forced to fight a war on two fronts. And it was communists who fought against Hitler and the Nazis every step of the way, and communists were the first people in Germany, and communists and labor organizers were the first people suppressed and killed during Hitler's rise to power. But they invert the history, and they talk about how the Holodomor was the same as the Holocaust. They both start with an H, and how Stalin was just as bad as Hitler. When Stalin was the one, Stalin and his people are the ones who fought Hitler. So now, people's minds have been so muddled, and their understanding of reality has been so confused that you can have the U.S. back the Azov battalion as they portray Russia as being fascist and themselves as fighting fascism and fighting for democracy. So yeah, that's why they do it, and that's why they don't want your mind to be sharp, and that's why you gotta read. So, alright, let's continue with this video. I'm kind of rambling. We'll watch for a bit longer.
Europe, the capitalist nations, and the Soviet Union met in order to discuss how to prevent another European war and how to rebuild the destroyed continent. They couldn't agree on anything, most importantly what economic system the continent should follow, so they decided to split the continent up and figure it out later. The eastern countries were to be rebuilt by the Soviet Union and the western ones by the US, UK, and France. Germany, right in the middle, was split up between the USSR and the capitalist nations, with Berlin being split up again. The Soviet Union was not able to support the eastern nations as it had to rebuild itself first. In the western nations, the free market was instituted and quickly did absolutely nothing. The US government did what it always did and does when capitalism isn't working, and gave away free money to stimulate the economy. This was called the Marshall Plan. To be more specific, capitalist nations were given US dollars, which had to be used on imports. I wonder what kind of country had an export-oriented economy which wasn't damaged in a war and which accepted US dollars. Well, so essentially, the US government was giving money to their friends which they then had to spend on US goods.
So the US was giving money to their friends for economic development so that their friends could then turn around and trade with the US, and it made Europe and the US very developed and rich? Sounds like China's Belt and Road Initiative. Or was the US doing imperialism against Europe here? I don't know.
In addition to this, much of the industry of Western capitalist nations was bought up or indebted to American capitalists and banks, who loaned money to the rebuilding continent. On top of that, the USA used the political leverage they got from the Marshall Plan to influence the elections in nations they occupied towards liberal free market economies. Essentially, the Western European nations were turned into...
And that part is actually different from what China's doing. China has pursued a policy of complete non-interventionism, which Yanis Varoufakis, who's a social democratic economic analyst from Greece, so he would know about this well, has said that China, their Belt and Road policy is different in the fact that it's completely non-interventionist. And yeah, they're peddling for influence, right? They want these countries they're helping to develop to side with China and engage in more economic activity with China, and for sure be more likely to support China politically when the U.S. is trying to destabilize their political sovereignty. So they're peddling for influence. But they're not doing what the U.S. is doing and saying, basically these are conditional upon you enacting free market austerity policies, right? Or China's not saying our loans to you are conditional based on your government being socialist, right? We're only going to trade with you if you're socialist. They trade with freaking Israel, They trade with the U.S. They trade with everyone. So it's more non-interventionist. But also, the Marshall Plan built up Europe so much, and it allowed the U.S. and their imperialist allies to really build up this like Western hegemonic dominance over the rest of the world, especially with the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s. By allowing European countries to develop themselves economically and rebuild themselves after the war. And that's what China's Belt and Road is trying to do, basically trying to replicate. And I compare the two because the interest rates on the loans that were part of the Marshall Plan were set at like 4%, which is what China's Belt and Road interest rates are usually set at, 4%. So it's the same thing where it's very low interest rates, so countries aren't ending up trapped in debt, drowning in debt, and reliant on the IMF and World Bank, like many countries in the global south, thanks to the U.S. and the West's structural adjustment loans.
Economic colonies or puppet states of the US. When Germany was split up, the four powers agreed on some conditions and rules they would follow in this joint occupation. Among them, they decided to use the same currency in Germany in order to make the reunification easier. This German currency was plagued by hyperinflation, which made the occupied territories illegible for the Marshall Plan. The obvious solution by the capitalist nations was to introduce a new currency. They did not discuss this at the four power meetings. They did not even inform the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. They just did it. This was seen as a breach of international law by the USSR, which then left the four power meetings altogether. The General Secretary was not happy with the partition of Germany in general. Pretty much all natural resources and industry of Germany are located here, outside of the Soviet zone. This was seen as an injustice, as the USSR had lost most blood in defeating fascism, and it felt like it deserved a richer area to pay reparations. The only industrial region of the Soviet occupation zone was Berlin, and Stalin demanded all of it so they may pay reparations. So Stalin demanded that the Allies stop their occupation of Berlin. When the Allies refused, he blockaded it. The blockade is when the Cold War officially starts. The Allies used planes to fly the supplies in, by the way, and Stalin stopped the blockade after about a year. And shortly later, the capitalist powers gave up any pretense of allowing Germany to unify, as they set up their own capitalist puppet state in their zones of occupation. A short time later, Stalin decided he could no longer occupy Germany and gave them a state of their own, the German Democratic Republic. Germany was now split. Stalin made a suggestion to the capitalist nations.
I just want to point out there's a good video about the GDR. I think it's from Socialist Swan. Is that who it is? Yes, it is. So, if you're curious in learning about what socialism was like in East Germany after they became the German Democratic Republic, this video from Socialist Swan, who's a British Marxist-Leninist, all these videos are really good. Obviously, there's a lot of Western nonsense to pick through when you're talking about this. So Socialist Swan does a really good job. Just another resource for y'all to check out there. Thought I'd give him a shout out because he did a good job with those videos, if I remember correctly.
He wanted to create a unified democratic Germany with international supervision. The Western nations declined this offer because they were afraid that the large socialist population in Germany may democratically vote to become socialist. And we all know that the problem with democracy is that sometimes the people vote differently from how you want them to. And the adult way to react to that is to simply not allow them to vote at all. On a strategic level, Europe was now divided and the capitalists were gearing for war. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill outright prepared a plan for the invasion of the Soviet Union called Operation Unthinkable, and the US Army was stationing bombers with nuclear bombs around the world in order to threaten and eventually destroy the Soviet Union and the socialist revolution therein. Luckily, there were people in the United States who were on the side of the people and who decided to send plans of the nuclear bombs to the Soviet Union. By 1949, the USSR had tested its first nuclear warhead. The US and USSR would continuously develop new and stronger nuclear weapons for the entire Cold War in order to keep the advantage on their side for when the inevitable war between capitalism and socialism would start. Meanwhile, in the United States, everyone who was a communist or a suspected communist was fired, arrested, and worse, in what's known as the McCarthy era. Throughout this, the United States still claimed to support freedom of expression. Then, in order to totally not escalate the Cold War, the capitalist nations banded together and formed NATO, an aggressive military alliance designed to threaten the Soviet Union and contain the revolution. Let's have a look at China. It was in a civil war. The main factions were the Communist People's Liberation Army under the leadership of Mao Zedong and the practically fascist Chinese Nationalist Party under the leadership of some fascist guy, I don't know, you won't remember the name anyway. They have been fighting since before World War II, then stopped when the Japanese showed up and started doing genocide, and right after the Japanese had surrendered, they were at each other's throats again. Long story short, the communists win and the nationalists have to go on this island, and they pretend to be the real China until this day, though nobody takes them seriously. In Korea, both the USA and USSR had installed temporary local leaders, which acted as placeholders until the peninsula would be united again. But after the capitalist nations had made it clear that the united Germany would not happen unless the Soviet Union agreed that it would be a capitalist state, the government in North Korea became a bit anxious. It was a socialist government backed by the USSR. The South was seen as occupied territory by the North, especially as the fascist capitalist government there was close friends with and funded by the American government. The Southern government committed many war crimes against suspected communists, often under the direction of US troops. By 1950, the North Korean government under Kim Il-sung decided to put an end to the fascists and started a liberation war against the dictatorship. When almost the entire peninsula was liberated, many capitalist nations came to support the fascist dictatorship. The effort of half of the world was not in vain, and the North Korean army was pushed back. Fearing that the capitalists might just keep going and invade Manchuria after they were done with Korea, Chairman Mao Zedong decided to send support to Korea. That support came in the form of 500,000 soldiers. The US general wanted to use nuclear weapons on the Chinese People's Liberation Army, but the president refused because of the fear that the Soviet Union might intervene and use their own nuclear weapons as well. After 3 years, the fronts were back to where they were before, and the Korean governments agreed on an armistice, which is in power until today. The South Korean people suffered under a series of US-backed fascist dictatorships until 1987, when they moved to a neoliberal democracy.
And ever since then, the U.S. has kept the North under the most stringent economic sanction regime in the history of the world, other than the one that's on Cuba. They're about the same. So 20%, according to U.S. pilots, of the North's people were killed in those bombing campaigns from the U.S. In what's called Korean War, or sometimes what's called the Forgotten War. Because it's just a blip in U.S. history when we basically destroyed the peninsula of Korea, half the peninsula of Korea, in order to back a fascist dictatorship. So ever since then, the U.S. has kept the North under stringent economic sanctions, while trying to pretend like socialism is what's keeping the country poor. After we bombed their country, leveling every building over 2 stories tall. Just horrific destruction what the U.S. unleashed on the North, but they were unable to defeat them. And like the video said, Mao sent help to the North, and actually Mao's son died from U.S. bombs in that war. So you see, I guess, just how U.S. imperialism affected people, or affects people in the global South or in the East. And you can see it on a personal level there, that even Mao, sent troops in order to save the Korean peninsula from total, fascistic dominance and Western colonial occupation. And his own son lost his life, to the imperialist aggression and to the imperialist hostility. And, we think about the DPRK today, and we think their people are so crazy, right? We think their people are so crazy because they hate Americans. But 20% of their population died, right? So that's 1 person in every family of 5. So think how many people have experienced trauma from the Korean War, or how many people's grandparents were killed in the Korean War in the North today. And in their minds, the war has been continued ever since because of the economic sanctions, and because, South Korea has remained occupied and capitalist, and have kept troops on the dividing line ever since. I can't even think of what it's called. The name of the line. But, and with the fall of the Soviet Union, which was one of the North's only trading partners with the U.S. sanction regime. It put the country into a state of hunger and in a state of extreme poverty. But the people continued to persevere. And then we act like they're crazy for hating the U.S. Like, Americans are just so ignorant of what we've done in the Korean Peninsula and the amount of devastation we've caused. And, how kind of incredible, not kind of incredible, how incredible it is that these people have maintained their sovereignty, and have continued to fight back and have not given up their land. So, yeah. He also talked about the KMT there, the people who China was fighting against in the Civil War. Also interesting to note that China worked with the KMT at first. The KMT were like they were calling themselves nationalists. So they originally worked with the KMT to throw out Japan and the colonizers. But then the KMT basically turned on them immediately, and the U.S. came in and started backing the KMT and supporting them. So that's when China had the Civil War, which was won by Mao and the Communists, and the KMT went to Taiwan for the most part. And then also, I just want to say about McCarthyism, one thing that I like to point out is that McCarthyism was not just in North America. McCarthyism was a thing in Latin America, and you can tell if you talk to Latin American right wingers today. They use the exact same talking, like silly McCarthyist talking points that you would hear from like a boomer in the U.S. Who says like Stalin killed 800 million people by eating all the grain himself. And part of the reason why is, I wish I could move my head right here on the screen, but Operation Condor, I'm trying to pull it up. So the U.S. or the CIA launched this campaign where they were arming and training right-wing governments and right-wing paramilitaries in Latin America, especially the southern cone of Latin America. And they were also training them in torture techniques. So they had developed all these torture techniques in MK Ultra, where they were, torturing people and giving them drugs and doing all these things to try and destroy their minds. And they were training up these dictators like Augusto Pinochet, these brutal Latin American paramilitaries like the Argentinian military junta, who killed or disappeared 7,000 to 30,000 people, according to this graph, and it's probably more than that, honestly. So McCarthyism was launched imperialistically across Latin America, and they basically, but much more brutally, in a much more brutal way than it was in the U.S., basically killing and torturing anybody with a left-wing ideology, and the CIA was literally giving the Latin American leaders kill lists. Right? Not only did Augusto Pinochet and the Argentinian military junta and all these terrible leaders come to power with the help of the CIA, with the explicit support of the CIA and the U.S. State Department, but then they were, given kill lists. The CIA would give them their intelligence. All right, here's all these leftists that we know are living in Argentina or Chile. So go kill them and torture them. Like when Pinochet came to power, the day he came to power, he killed thousands of leftists in Chile's national soccer stadium. Like, you think that doesn't scare people out of supporting socialism or learning about socialism, And Bolivia, the Bolivian government likely would have been unable to find and kill Che Guevara without the help of the West and without the help of the CIA. So I always just say McCarthyism wasn't just a thing in America. The empire exported McCarthyism, especially to Latin America. Yep, that's all I got to say. This video is pretty great so far, in my opinion. Someone in the chat says, Stalin ate my dog's grain, and he paid the clouds not to rain. Yes, that's true. And if you read Socialism, or if you read Communism, on page 1, Karl Marx says that socialism is when you bribe the clouds not to rain, so everyone starves. And, Stalin was a major adherent of that. So, really makes you think. Makes me cry every time.
Let's have a look at Germany again. Corrections, Germanys, plural. In the 50s, they were brought up under drastically different economic systems. West Germany was organized in a capitalist free market economy, and at first it wasn't doing well. After being included in the Marshall Plan, however, it quickly started doing pretty well. Remember, the Marshall Plan was basically the US giving free money to capitalists to help them fund businesses and such. Meanwhile, East Germany had a centralized socialist economy which had a harder time growing, since they didn't have access to the same amount of free money. Also, the Soviets had taken loads of money and industrial machinery as reparations, since Germany kind of destroyed all of Russia like 5 years earlier. On top of that, the East German economy was smaller at the beginning of the separation, as I've mentioned before. So economically, West Germany was doing better. But East Germany had its perks, among others, a 0% unemployment rate.
Also, similar situation with North and South Korea, because the U.S. was giving the same free money to South Korea, and Jimmy Carter even said in a speech, the U.S. has done everything they can to sanction and starve and destroy the North. And then, meanwhile, they've done everything they can to bolster the South. But then today, even in South Korea, movies like Parasite or art like Squid Game is coming out of South Korea, which just demonstrates how capitalism has deteriorated there and led to these insane levels of inequality. And they still have a very authoritarian government, and their intelligence agency is basically just a mini CIA. But similar to what the U.S. did in Germany.
Free healthcare, free education, and so on. West Germany had none of those at this time. So the East had many highly educated people who were educated by the state and expected to help improve the country in exchange. So it kind of sucked for the East German government to see the West Germans handing out free money to everyone with higher education who would move from East Germany to West Germany. The West German government also made sure to spread lots of propaganda about how anyone could become rich under capitalism. So young people who were educated for free by the East German state and who were expected to return this value to the state via working there decided to leave to a capitalist country in hopes of making themselves rich off their stolen East German education. This was seen as a betrayal by the East German state, and some went as far as to denounce those who left for West Germany as traitors to their nation. And there were more problems originating in West Berlin. The Cold War was a really good time for spies.
Yeah, and in the North and South, that's a lot of what that intelligence agency, the South Korean intelligence agency, that's basically a mini CIA, they try to get people to defect. And there's even a TV show in South Korea where defectors who working with this intelligence agency, where defectors go and just tell stories about how evil and how terrible the North is. But what a lot of these agencies do, or what the intelligence agency does, is they have brokers who will find North Koreans traveling abroad, or visiting China. And they'll say, we'll give you $100,000, if you defect, if you come with us. And it's never a good idea. There's so many interviews and so many stories of people who weren't paid or who didn't understand, or who were lied to and weren't given the benefits they were promised, or who just didn't understand capitalism and how much poverty they would be in once they left, or didn't and now they're in a world with no family. They're considered traitors to their country, and they have to survive. And it's just a really rough situation that these people are left in the vast majority of the time. The ones who don't become like celebrity defectors like Yeonmi Park. So yeah, it's a really, really horrible thing what this intelligence agency and what the brokers do. So yeah, you hear about communist countries like shooting people at the border and not letting anyone leave, and hating people for leaving, and there's truth to it, and it's sad, and I wish people, would be more free to move from place to place, but you also see the reason for it, right? The reason why communist countries don't want people to leave, because the U.S. is dividing countries in half, and then handing a bunch of free money to one country and saying, this is the best, come over here, this country's better, leave your communist country. And you've had like a situation in Venezuela where a lot of the skilled labor has fled to places where they can make more money. And yeah, it's just a really interesting situation, and it's absolutely a contradiction of having two economic systems, of trying to build socialism in one country, right? Well, you have this contradiction where developing socialism, developing the productive forces and making yourselves rich is going to take a while. despite the fact that socialism's a superior economic system. So in that time that you're building up socialism, the West, the imperialist capitalists who have hoarded all this wealth, can pay all the skilled labor to leave your country, or they can try. So yeah, very, very interesting stuff to think and talk about, I think.
West was spying on the East and the East was spying on the West. Remember the nuclear bombs from the US? They were brought to the USSR by spies. And there were many spies moving from East to West and the other way around. And the key path they used was Berlin. The reason for that is that there was no border there. You could just walk down the street and you'd be out of the country you're spying on and inside the country you're spying for. And at one point, the Politburo decided to handle these problems originating in Berlin accordingly. In order to stop the traitors and spies, the decision was made to impose the border in Berlin the same way the outside borders of the country were imposed. This meant border guards, checkpoints, barbed wire, and no crossing without reason. The capitalist countries were quick to complain about the Berlin Wall as it became known. They said the East German government had torn Berlin apart. A brave statement considering it was the Western powers that continued to occupy half of the capital city of another country. Like, can you imagine Saudi Arabia occupying half of Washington DC and then complaining that the US is tearing Washington apart when they begin to guard their border? Okay, while I'm outside of the monologue, I'd like to address some serious misinformation about the Berlin Wall. It's often said that it was locking people in or out, and that's not quite true. If you were West German and wanted to go to West Berlin or the other way around, you could just use the East German highways to do so. West Berlin was not trapped, they could leave at any time. And it is often said that the wall was tearing families apart by preventing travel. That's a very biased way of telling the story. East Germans were allowed to visit West Germany provided they had a reason, and a marriage, a funeral, or even just visiting a sick relative were enough. And West Germans could visit East Germany just as well. Saying that the wall separated families is technically true, but by that logic you'd have to agree that all borders do so, and that thus all borders should be considered as bad as the Berlin Wall, which is a road you could go down, but it isn't usually thought to its conclusion like that. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, the Berlin Wall was built and enforced as a regular border. This stayed up for a bit and will return to Germany once something happens there. Meanwhile, in the USSR, Stalin died and Khrushchev was telling everyone that he was bad. This started a tradition of Soviet leaders being shit-talked once they died, something that did not help the Soviet Union with stability. In order to counter NATO, the Soviet Union founded the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance with the express goal of countering NATO, not threatening the USA, just creating a counterweight to capitalist aggression. Also, the nations have now figured.
So before he moves on, because I imagine here we're going to start talking more about geopolitics and more about NATO, I just want to make one more point about East and West Germany. There's a really good book from Kristen Godsey. It is called Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, which is a provocative title, but there's only like 1 or 2 chapters about sex, and all the other arguments are just arguments for why a socialist economic system is better for women overall. So the full title is Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence, which is basically what it is. But she looks at interviews with women in East and West Germany, and she finds that generally East Germans reported being more sexually satisfied when the countries were divided, when they were separate. And then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when East Germany became capitalist and when they were just Germany again, the women reported decreased sexual satisfaction, decreased sexual pleasure, as well as some other, and probably because of some other things. They listed some things as reasons. One major reason was that under the socialist economic system, they were free to leave their partner at any time, right? They could leave their partner and they knew they would still be economically stable. They would still have a job. They would still have health care. They would still have housing. So if they were in a relationship that was maybe an abusive relationship, they felt more free to leave, because some women are trapped in abusive relationships by their economic circumstances under capitalism. Also, the women in East Germany felt that the men were better under the socialist economic system because they weren't just trying to impress the women with money. They weren't just trying to impress the women based on their status in the market, which is a phenomenon we see under capitalism a lot. I saw a TikTok the other day of some guy at a bar just showing a woman his bank account. Just trying to be like, look, I have a lot of money, like, date me. And there's so much effort to, like, flex your wealth, and your economic stability under capitalism, because not everyone has economic stability. So the book argues that women had better relationships under socialism. They were freer under socialism in their relationships, and they actually had better sex under socialism, reportedly. And then, after the fall of after the fall of the Soviet Union, Berlin Wall is taken down. The East Germans reported, or statistically, these things got worse. Right, you see divorce rates go down. Women are leaving their husbands less, which some people might think is a good thing. But it's also reported that more women are in domestic relationships where they're experiencing domestic abuse, and there wasn't prostitution and sex trafficking at all under the socialist system in East Germany. But after the Berlin Wall fell, prostitution and sex trafficking flooded back over the border, along with drug trafficking. So we see that that's a phenomenon that follows capitalism wherever it goes, because capitalism commodifies everything, and it forces everybody to sell something, sell their labor power in order to survive. So sex trafficking is an inevitable result of capitalism. And this is proven by the fact that it came into the Soviet Union after the dissolution, as well as into East Germany. So yeah, interesting book. I would recommend that. Or Kristen Godsey has given some interviews or some lectures where she talks about her core arguments in this book. Very, very interesting. I gave it to my sister, which I was like, it's weird to give your sister a book about sex, but I was like, most of the arguments aren't about sex. You can tear those pages out.
Figured out how to make even more deadly bombs and how to use rockets to deliver them without them being intercepted. These rockets could also be used differently. In 1957, some Soviet scientists got very excited to use those missiles to learn stuff about space. And after a bit of development, they managed to put the first ever artificial satellite in space, Sputnik. It was just a silver ball going beep beep in space, but it was a tremendous achievement for humanity.
Sorry, the one other thing I wanted to add, because it's a major part of that Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism book, is pregnancy. Women in the USSR had knew they would have daycare, and they had paid maternal leave by law. So the USSR wanted women to be home with the baby, when they had the baby, so they could raise it and they could take time off work. And capitalists in the U.S. know that it takes time to raise a child. So they're less likely to hire women, right? And this is a major mechanism that drives the gender pay gap. As you see, capitalists don't want to hire women because if women get pregnant, it's going to distract them and make it harder to just put all their time and effort into their career. And men do not have to worry about that. So yeah, just wanted to make that point because it's a really, 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 really good point.
I say for humanity, and in the socialist nations it was definitely seen as such, but in the capitalist nations the public reacted differently. They were scared of Sputnik, because now suddenly they saw that the socialist nations were technologically superior. This was known as the Sputnik crisis. The USA then decided to do the same and put an artificial satellite in orbit. The first rocket promptly blew up on the launch pad in front of the media of the whole world. Then the Soviet Union sent a dog to space. Her name was Laika, and she was the first living animal ever to reach space. Then the USSR sent a man to space, then took the first picture of the dark side of the moon, the first automated landing on the moon, the first woman in space, the first landing on another planet, all with the US lagging behind the Soviet Union. So, in an effort to not look totally inferior anymore, the US president announced that they would land on the moon. Long story short, after enlisting literal genocidal Nazis in their spaceflight program, they managed it. Then they stuck their flag into the moon, presumably in an attempt to make it theirs, and declared that they had won the space race. Before that, the Soviet government put out a statement declaring moon landings are too dangerous to attempt. The landing was seen live on TV by billions of people, including in the Soviet Union. The government of the USSR then suggested a joint moon landing as a sign of friendship. While the USSR never landed on the moon, there was a joint mission between American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts in 1975, when they docked their spaceships and said hi or something like that. Let's now have a look at Cuba. Cuba belonged to the US for a long time, Then these handsome men came along and made it not so. They did a socialism, so the US tried to invade but failed. Quickly.
I actually didn't know that about the space race. I didn't know that the Soviets offered the U.S. to do a joint moon landing. That's a good thing to know because, like he pointed out, the USSR totally won the space race. They had all these advancements, and then the U.S. Went ahead and landed on the moon and declared themselves the winners. Which, it was the government filtered literal Nazis into NASA, like you said, and NASA is, largely a publicly funded thing, right? They're connected to various private organizations, especially today. But, it's largely like a government-funded, publicly funded thing, so people act like the moon landing is the U.S. winning the space race, which proves the superiority of the free market. Such a absolutely absurd argument. And I didn't know the USSR offered the joint moon landing as a sign of friendship. That's interesting.
Look at Turkey. They joined NATO and the USA had set up nuclear missiles there which could directly attack Moscow and kill millions of people. After the Cuban Revolution, the Soviet General Secretary called and asked if they wanted to help do the same to the US. Cuba agreed and the USSR was about to place nuclear missiles there when the Americans noticed. The US president did not want to allow the USSR to do the same as they had done, so he forbid Cuba to place Soviet missiles there. Then they enforced a blockade on Cuba, which they enforced by throwing depth charges at Soviet submarines, which were armed with nuclear weapons. Please note that this is an act of war, both the blockade and the throwing depth charges at the nuclear submarine. But hey, what could go wrong? It's not like the crew of the submarine could have assumed that war had broken out and that they should fire their nuclear torpedo at the American fleet, right? Oh yeah, that's exactly what happened. The world came within one decision of a nuclear war because the capitalist country didn't want to allow another country to do the same thing they had done, and because it had decided that attacking a nuclear submarine was somehow okay. It turned out well in the end. The USA agreed to remove nuclear missiles from Turkey, and the USSR agreed not to put nuclear missiles on Cuba. In case you were wondering, no. The international community did not take action against the USA for attacking the ships of a country they were at peace with, or for enforcing a blockade in peace times. Let's have a look at Vietnam, shall we?
So you can read now a lot of the transcripts that took place when JFK and the other higher-ups in the U.S. government and U.S. State Department and intelligence agencies were discussing what to do during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, I mean, because there was like a microphone, or it was, maybe they recorded it on purpose, and now it's been released through a Freedom of Information Act, and you can read the transcripts. And, JFK is certainly no angel, right? He was certainly a Cold Warrior, anti-communist. But, if you read those transcripts, he looks pretty good compared to the State Department officials and the CIA intelligence operatives surrounding him. Because they were arguing every step of the way to push closer to war. I mean, that's really what brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, was there were people in the president's ear, telling him to be more hostile, to be more aggressive, to invade the country of Cuba, to send the U.S. military, to launch a bombing campaign against Cuba. Just absurd hostility and, an incredible amount of not caring, apathy towards, human life, and the potential of nuclear war between not imperialist powers, between the imperialist U.S. and the socialist bloc. So yeah, I recommend people read those transcripts if you get a chance, and it helps you realize how psychotic and greedy and bloodthirsty the people who have been running our country are, to the point where they can make JFK look like the only really rational one in the room.
So basically, in the before times, that means before 1900, France came along and took this land. That's imperialism. Skipping over a lot of history, the people here did not like being a colony of France anymore, and after World War II, France was not able to kill all of them anymore, so in 1954, at the Geneva Conference, they decided what to do with this area. They decided to split it up into these three countries. These two became monarchies, but wait, Vietnam had lots of communists in it, and they wanted to rule the country. But the capitalist countries did not want that. The US and USSR could not agree on what to do with Vietnam, most importantly what economic system it should follow, so they decided to split it up and figure it out later. But unlike with Germany and Korea, this time they had agreed on how to figure it out. This part would be communist, this part would be capitalist, and in 2 years they would unify and hold one national election under international supervision to decide what economic system all of Vietnam should use. What a great solution! Unfortunately, it was predicted that the North would win because it had a higher population. So the US decided that rather than risking the small country doing what the people want, they should launch a full-scale invasion. Essentially, the Vietnam War boiled down to the capitalists thinking they would win because of their technological superiority, but then getting wrecked by a few farmers armed with AK-47s. By 1974, the US president decided to retreat and give up while pretending that they totally won. The capitalist southern government fell within 1 year and all of Vietnam was now socialist. Let's now look at Afghanistan.
I remember once as a kid, I asked a family member, has the U.S. ever lost a war? Because I was hoping that the U.S. had won all our wars and that we were undefeated because we were the best country. That's what I wanted to hear as a kid. And my grandma said, yeah, we lost Vietnam. And she's like, wars nowadays you can't even really say, and this is a conservative person. She's like, wars nowadays you can't really say, who won or lost. There's just a lot of devastation, loss of human life, which is all war. But she's like, World War II had a decisive winner, so that's different. And it was different, but like the U.S. definitely lost in Vietnam. And I remember like fighting that in my head. I'm like, no, we won Vietnam. We just decided to leave, like after we won. Trying to convince myself that, and then I remember talking to people about it. And there were people who would feed me that, be like, yeah, like adults who would be like, yeah, the U.S. really won Vietnam. We rock. And then getting older and realizing that not only did the U.S. get their butts handed to them, and not only have we lost, a lot of wars, depending on how you define losing, but any way you define losing, the U.S. has lost a lot. But it was just a war of complete senseless devastation where the U.S. was dropped tons of napalm and Agent Orange, destroyed farmlands and waterways for years to come, leaving the country filled with toxicity. Just this horrible, horrific intervention for, that was the closest the U.S. ever got to doing a war for ideological purposes rather than their own direct material interests. There were, material resources that they wanted to control in Vietnam, right? And the Cold War was about ideology in certain ways, every U.S. invasion, but mostly it was the U.S. trying to protect their direct material interests. Whether it was certain mineral resources or whatever that these various countries had. But as he kind of explained in Vietnam there, the U.S. basically just didn't want communism to show its superiority in the North versus the South, so they decided to launch this full-scale, devastating intervention, and told people at home that it was to stop the spread of communism. As we claim to be this country who respects freedom of expression, we respect freedom of expression, but we will bomb your farmlands and schools and hospitals if you express something that we don't like.
To sum it up painfully quickly, the government was overthrown by a new socialist government known as the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. This government was quickly attacked.
Sorry, I'm interested in this part. I've been researching Afghanistan a lot lately. But I wanted to read something in the chat. The U.S. may lose full contact hot wars, but it does successfully win the silent wars. A lot of the time, not always though. A lot of Marxist-Leninist countries like China and the Soviets too combated a lot of the U.S.'s attempted silent wars in their country. And someone else says the U.S. dropped more bombs on Laos than they did on Nazi Germany, which is an incredible statistic. Thank you for sharing that. Guarantee it's true because of how many, like I said, the sheer number of bombs that the U.S. dropped on Vietnam. And there's a quote from Anthony Bourdain about Henry Kissinger in Cambodia that has a similar message to that statistic. and shows just how horrific the U.S. bombing campaigns in this region were, including Laos and Cambodia. So Anthony Bourdain says, once you've been to Cambodia, you'll never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands. You will never again be able to open a newspaper and read about that treacherous, prevaricating, I don't even know that word, prevaricating, murderous scumbag sitting down for a nice chat with Charlie Rose or attending some black tie affair for a new glossy magazine without choking. Witness what Henry did in Cambodia, the fruit of his genius for statesmanship, and you will never understand why he's not sitting in the dock at The Hague next to Milosevic, which is, the U.S. launched a bombing campaign against Yugoslavia and in the Balkans, kind of similar to the one they launched against Vietnam and Cambodia, not on the same level, but also just carpet bombed the country, apparently to stop Milosevic. That was the justification NATO gave. So he's also taking a shot at NATO and the U.S. there, saying, Milosevic is this horrific war criminal who the U.S. carpet bombed his country to stop, apparently. And, he's been tried as a war criminal, but we have Henry Kissinger sitting at black tie affairs when he's done some of the most horrific war crimes in human history against Cambodia. So Bourdain continues, while Henry continues nibble nori rolls and ramaki at A-list parties, Cambodia, the neutral nation he secretly and illegally bombed, invaded, undermined, and then threw to the dogs, is still trying to raise itself up on its one remaining leg. Crazy. So he went to Cambodia, and the people are still alive. Like Luna Oi has a really good video on YouTube talking to her mom. And her mom was a school child, going to school when the war was happening. And the Americans blew up her school. She was went to school one day and then they had to run and go to the bomb shelter and they bombed her school. So this isn't just people's grandparents or great-grandparents, this is their parents, who experienced this, who were bombed by the US, who had their schools bombed by the US. They're still alive today to tell you the stories. So Anthony Bourdain went to Cambodia, and he heard the stories from people, and he realized how horrific the American empire and its the people who run it, like Henry Kissinger, how horrible they are. Thank you to UP1 for subscribing. Thank you so much for your support. I appreciate that. All right, let's continue.
The government was overthrown by a new socialist government known as the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. This government was quickly attacked by reactionary insurgencies and then asked the Soviet Union to help. And as you do among comrades, in 1979, the USSR intervened. The USA then gave lots of money to the people fighting the USSR, that being Al-Qaeda among others. After about 10 years, the Soviet government decided it could no longer deal with this and left again. The Democratic Republic of Afghanistan then quickly fell to the reactionary armies. Those armies then later blew up 2 towers in New York, but that's a different story. At this time, the Cold War was warming up. This is known as détente. The USA and USSR were still pointing nuclear weapons at each other, but now at least they weren't throwing live bombs at nuclear submarines anymore. They signed the SALT Treaty, which stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which limited the number of nuclear bombs and missiles they could make. As is tradition, I completely neglected Latin America in this video. Basically, it's always the same story. A country elects a socialist government, and then the CIA stages a coup and...
Hey, I got you. I got you, Viki. Viki1999. I already talked about Operation Condor. So, that's what I call teamwork, baby.
And kills all suspected communists and props up a fascist puppet regime there. There's a Wikipedia article about it. If I mentioned all of those, the video would be twice as long. In the late 80s, the German people were demonstrating against the Berlin Wall. To oversimplify, they had been talking about letting people travel over the inter-German border without visa for some time. Then this man misread something in a press briefing, and as a result, half of the population of East Berlin wanted to go have a look at the West. They thought they had the right to cross the border now. The guards still had orders not to let them pass. Eventually, they could not hold the people anymore and just let everyone go to West Berlin. The Berlin Wall was gone now. Please note that most people in East Germany did not want to live under capitalism or to unite with the capitalist West Germans. What they wanted was a new and more democratic East German republic with good relations with and free movement to West Germany.
And there are legitimate critiques, especially in East Germany, of authoritarianism. Like, everyone's heard of the Stasi, the secret police, and, you know, it's not what the U.S. has portrayed them as. And like we said, there were reasons why they had the wall, you know, and why they weren't letting people leave, because they didn't want their skilled workers to flee or be bribed by the U.S. And, you know, the U.S. was trying to infiltrate the country, right? So you need some form of police, you know, to find when there are legitimate security threats, right, to protect the country from legitimate imperialist attempts to destabilize it. But, you know, they got pretty repressive. You know, it had some negative effects in East Germany because they were trying so hard not to allow the capitalists or the imperialists who work for the capitalist state departments, not let them infiltrate and destabilize the country. So, you know, the effect of that was the people were pretty heavily monitored, so they did want more democracy. But as we were talking about, you know, the vast majority of them did not like the economic system that came afterwards. It was much, much worse for women. And as this statistic right here says that we see on screen, 71% of East Germans did not want the reunification of Germany. So much different than what we're taught in the West about the evil East Germany under the repression of the Stasi, who celebrated when the Berlin Wall fell and have been living in paradise ever since.
71% of East Germans opposed the unification of Germany. Unfortunately, the Chancellor of West Germany wanted to get re-elected, so he united the two countries against the will of the people. There is a video to be made on.
Someone says the NSA is 100,000 times worse and more intrusive than any other surveillance program in history. Yeah. I should have pointed that out as well. What Edward Snowden has revealed about the NSA spying makes the U.S. much, much worse than anything the KGB or the Stasi has ever done. But, yeah. Sorry, I want to read one more quote from the chat because we're getting a lot of good stuff from the chat today. This is a quote from Muhammad Ali about going to Vietnam. "The real enemy of my people is here. I will not disgrace my religion, my people, or myself by becoming a tool to enslave those who are fighting for their own justice, freedom, and equality. If I thought the war was going to bring freedom and equality to 22 million of my people, they wouldn't have to draft me. I'd join tomorrow. I'll go to jail. So what? We've been in jail for 400 years. Muhammad Ali." So, someone was saying, like, combat sports are reactionary earlier. You need to read some Muhammad Ali. Alright. Let's finish up this video.
This, since 30 years later, the old East German states still suffer immensely from this, and they likely will for the next 50 years. Things like these were happening all over the socialist world, and many countries reformed their way into or were forced into free market capitalism. Then Gorbachev came into power in the USSR, and he implemented Perestroika and Glasnost, which were policies that had to do with, well, actually, the collapse of the Soviet Union is definitely going to be its own video, so subscribe. Essentially, he did some reform, screwed it up, and collapsed the Soviet Union in the process. And this is where the Cold War ends, with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this was my biased telling of the story of the Cold War. Please know, everything I said was correct. It's all true. So why does it sound like I'm an evil Soviet spy sent to indoctrinate everyone into thinking the capitalist nations were aggressors in the Cold War? Because we aren't used to hearing that part of the story. When talking about the Cold War, we hear about the Berlin Wall tearing families apart all the time. But we never talk about the fact that the US invaded a sovereign country because they were afraid that an election might go differently from how they wanted to go. We are used to thinking that the Soviets were aggressors in the Cuba crisis, placing missiles and such. But we barely even mention that the US had been doing the same thing in Turkey, or that the US literally breached international law by imposing a blockade on Cuba during peacetime, and by attacking Soviet submarines. And we're used to thinking about the Soviet nations in the East as the Soviet bloc, but we barely even talk about the fact that the entirety of Western Europe was practically controlled by the US. Do you think it's a coincidence that no nation occupied by the Americans turned socialist? The Americans made sure to only support the correct parties, the same way the Soviets did. So, now you know the Soviet version of the story. Do I think that we should write this version in the history books? Not really. It's just as biased as the story we already hear, and it's based on some shaky facts just as well. I'd like to hear a story without bias for once, not one where evil Stalin tried to starve Berlin into submission, or one where the evil capitalist nations refused to vacate the capital of a sovereign state. I want a story with both sides, not just the one we like better. Ultimately, it might be impossible to tell a story without bias, but at least now, after having watched this, you might be a bit better at detecting subtle biases. Always ask yourself what the other side of the story may look like, because maybe the Soviet side of the Cuban Missile Crisis might seem a lot more reasonable than the American one. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video of mine. If you did,
Great video. Thank you to Jacob for sending that. Sending it a couple times before we watched it. Great work by Viki1999 there, whatever. It's an account I'm not familiar with. I'm gonna subscribe right now, because that was good content. You know, when I talk about the Cold War, you know, when people ask me what it was, you know, there's so many people who say like the Soviet Union was social imperialist. You know, or of course the Western capitalist argument is that the Soviet Union was imperialist and they were doing the same thing as the U.S. but just in the name of communism. You know, or they were doing much worse than the U.S. in the name of communism, and the U.S. had to come in and save these countries from communism. You know, that's the CIA argument. And there was a leaked document that Vijay Prashad talks about in his book Washington Bullets. The leaked CIA document where they were saying explicitly, we are going to accuse the Soviet Union of doing imperialism, you know, equating our interventions with their interventions, like with Afghanistan, for example, and then say that, you know, everything we're doing is to save the world from Soviet imperialism, and that's why we got to do it, you know, and we can use that argument regardless of what we're doing and who we're arming. So, yeah, and what I tell people is, you know, I'm not a huge fan of Khrushchev, obviously, definitely not a Khrushchevite. I think that's, he was kind of the way he, threw dirt all over Stalin's grave as soon as he died, and then, used that to bring himself into power and enacted a lot of reformist stuff that, I'm not a fan of. And, you know, I think there are critiques to be made of even the foreign policy during that time, but I don't think they were just social imperialists and going around doing the same thing that the U.S. was doing, or just trying to control the world and control foreign economies the same way that the U.S. was all around the world. Mostly what it was the U.S. would back the most horrible extremists and violent right-wing separatists. Anywhere where there was a socialist revolution that would come about, the U.S. would give them funding, it would give them arms, it would give them aid, it would give them help from the CIA, it would give them CIA intelligence, or the CIA would work with them directly to overthrow whatever leader the U.S. didn't like. They armed fascistic militias like the Contras in Nicaragua, or the fascists in South Korea, or the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And basically what the Soviet Union did was back the Socialist Party. You know, whatever Socialist Party was coming to power at the time and was fighting against the U.S. paramilitaries or the U.S. Fascist forces or right-wing forces that they were backing on the ground, or even helping to create on the ground. The Soviet Union would say, okay, we support, you know, the socialists, and then at times they would give funding or arms or support to the socialists. In Afghanistan, the democratic Marxist government requested the Soviet Union send military support 10 times. They requested it 10 times before the Soviet Union actually did send support. And then, like they said, the Soviets did before leaving. And you can criticize that policy, but to say it's just social imperialist, or to say it's the same thing as what the CIA was doing all around the world, or the U.S. State Department, or that it justifies the U.S. State Department, you know, going into these countries and bombing them to stop the spread of communism, is just absurd. That's just not a correct way to look at it. You know, the Soviet Union was protecting their own interests and you know, coming to the aid of socialist countries who established themselves by trading with them as the U.S. was trying to blockade them. But, you know, that's the U.S. doing imperialism and the Soviet Union helping those countries like Cuba circumnavigate imperialism and the imperialist blockades, right? That's not the Soviet Union doing imperialism in Cuba because they gave them economic support as the U.S. was trying to starve their people. Same thing with the DPRK. So, very, very interesting. flooded us with cocaine to do it too. Yeah. First time chat from this viewer, a macabre centric, interesting username. Yeah, the CIA facilitated the sale of crack cocaine in U.S. neighborhoods. Of course, majority black neighborhoods. And allowed the Contras to make a bunch of money by flooding our streets with drugs. So again, we see the alliance between drug trafficking and capitalism, and even capitalist imperialism. Great video there.